Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Jazakallah, everyone, for taking time and joining us again for our weekly Tabligh talk. Today's program is in English, and on behalf of our National Tabligh team and our National Secretary Ibrahim Akhlaf Saab, I welcome you all to our program. Ibrahim Saab couldn't join us today because of his other busy schedule, but he said his salam to everyone. Today's topic is again the series we have started 2 weeks ago, and we have again today Dr. Umar Nasser with us. He's senior member of our National Tabligh department and also an active member of our Jamaat. Without taking any further time, if I can hand over to Dr. Saab.
Sorry, I was on mute. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm just going to get everything shared. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share this. Okay, can you all see that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, is it half a screen at the moment?
Yeah, at the moment, yeah, I can see your whole thing, desktop.
Okay. I'm going to need a few notes to read from at parts of this. So I'm assuming, is that still big enough for everyone to see? Does it still look okay? So I can't share everything. Yeah, it's okay? Okay. Okay, assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thanks very much for obviously joining this Tabligh session. What I've been asked to talk about is the concept of God in world religions. But I want to take it from this particular angle, which is the question of whether religion evolved. Because this will help us to kind of contextualize things and make it kind of relevant when we're discussing this with the people in the modern world and with atheists in particular. And the reason why is because obviously we live in a world where it's very, very secular and where the idea of God is sort of scorned at. And there are theories which try to explain the origins of religion through purely material causes and through purely natural causes. So that's something which we obviously need to answer back to, because we obviously believe that religion was revealed by Allah to God. And, you know, the Quran says many times that there was not a messenger, there was not a people, but we sent a messenger to them. And it says, you know, worship Allah and shun the evil one. So the religious theory of why, or the Quranic theory as to why we have different religions, is that we had different peoples, and Allah Ta'ala sent them prophets to those specific peoples. And over time, Allah Ta'ala, you know, mankind increased in its mental capacities and in its civilization. And at a certain time in the 6th century and 7th century AD, that Allah sent the Holy Prophet ﷺ as the final law-bearing messenger for all the people for all time. So in previous eras, prophets came to the individual people with a specific teaching for their own people. Islam came as the final religion. And the Islamic theory is that basically you have monotheism to begin with, and Allah himself reveals a monotheistic religion, worship one God and shun the evil one, shun Satan. But over time that degenerates. Now the naturalistic or the secular explanations are quite different, and that's what we're going to examine today. And I really want to kind of take it back to the root of these ideas from the atheists. And the root of them, as far as I could find out, was from this book called The Natural History of Religion by David Hume. David Hume was a 17th or 18th century. He was a Scottish philosopher, very influential philosopher, you know, thought to be the best philosopher by many of the Western world. And he had this book, The Natural History of Religion. It's quite funny if you read it, to be honest, because it's very, very sure of itself. despite not having that much evidence for anything. So here's basically what he said. And he kind of, as far as I can tell, he was the pioneer of a lot of these theories. So that's what we're going to have a look at. And I want to take out one or two quotes, and then I'm going to explain to you his basic idea. And this has been used by many people. So here's one quote. He says, if I can move this. He says, "It appears to me that if we consider the improvement of human society from rude beginnings to a state of greater perfection, polytheism or idolatry was, and necessarily must have been, the first and most ancient religion of mankind." So he says that if you look at how human society progresses from a state of, degeneracy to a state of what he understood as being perfection, that is Europe in the 17th and 18th century, polytheism or idolatry was and necessarily must have been the first and most ancient religion of mankind. He says, the farther we mount up into antiquity, the more do we find mankind plunged into polytheism. No marks, no symptoms of any more perfect religion. The most ancient records of the human race still present us with that system as the popular and established creed. The North, the South, the East, the West give their unanimous testimony to the same fact. What can be opposed to so full an evidence? So he's saying, if you look everywhere in the world, and actually, let me just check when he was, because I'll add to it. So I think it's, so 1711 to 1776, so the 18th century. So he's saying, based on the extensive investigation of the Europeans in the early 18th century, that he had evidence which was so full as to say that the farther you go up into antiquity, you find mankind plunged into polytheism. And then he goes on to develop these ideas as to how this could have happened. How did you get the idea of multiple gods, and then how did it turn into one god over time? And I want to outline his ideas. And obviously, these are covered by Khalifa Rabi in book Revelation, Rationality, Knowledge, and Truth. And that's where basically the argument or the counter argument that I'm going to be presenting comes from. So the essential idea is that, firstly, let's say you have primitive humans. You have primitive humans many millennia ago, and they have a world that's full of great difficulties. They have, they have plagues, they have diseases, they have thunderstorms, they have, rains which sometimes bring the harvest, and sometimes, there's a famine or there's a drought. So they have all these difficulties. There are all these natural forces which are affecting them at all times, but they don't really know when, what's going to happen. They can't really understand what the pattern is, if there's any, they don't have any real understanding of what's happening. So what he said is that you have hopes and you have fears, and he said fears are more motivating. And basically this primitive man, according to him, had hopes and fears. And essentially he said that, well, these forces, these natural forces, must have a spirit behind them. There must be some kind of spirit controlling these things, controlling the thunder, controlling the rain, controlling the ground, the soil, controlling everything. So there is a spirit that is controlling everything, all these different forces. And what do you do when there's a spirit? Well, he says, well, basically what they did is they anthropomorphized them. They made them human-like. Okay, now the next picture is a little bit scary, but it's a good depiction, so I apologize. But basically, this is the idea that there are spirits out there, and they control natural forces, and these have to be pleased, because if you want to have your harvest, if you want to be saved from the thunderstorm, if you want to be saved from disease, you need to ask these forces, these spirits, what is actually, please stop this. And this is what he thinks becomes prayer. And over time, people change their conception of these spirits. And he says, basically, you get spirits that become bigger and bigger and bigger. So, let's say you have some Arctic dwelling civilization, and they have a spirit which is, like this. They think, well, our god, they'll call them gods at this point, our god is bigger than yours, and ours is a really huge invisible person that can vanquish these demons. And then, maybe they start competing with each other, and they say, well, my god's better than yours, your god's, worse than mine, and they start adding to their conception of God. And as they do this, they kind of pray more and more to these gods. And eventually, according to Hume, this ended up in belief in one God. So you have prayer. So this is, an Eastern temple. You have people praying to these these spirits, and they start to make idols of them because they want to have a place specifically where they can make where they can pray, and they want to make rituals out of this. So they create temples and they create idols over time, and that's why, for instance, this is the Bhagavad Gita in Hinduism, which is a very old religion, probably the oldest religion that we have. You have these kind of rituals, and this is a remnant of that early development of mankind. So you start to have rituals, etc. And eventually, you give it a few thousand years, and because people become smarter, they think, well, maybe I'll just combine all these different gods into one god and say, that there's one god, and I'll call him Allah or Yahweh, that kind of thing. So the idea is basically you have this slow progression from real polytheism to real monotheism. And that's probably what we obviously believe best demonstrated in Islam, but Hume thought that was in Christianity, and the Abrahamic faiths, of course. So that's the basic idea. You have hopes and fears. You say that they are spirits controlling them. You pray to these spirits, and that's how religious rituals happen. And over time, your spirits become idols, and your idols become temples. And then you sort of just add up your idols, and we say, well, one god's big, the other's big, and actually there's one god that's really, really big, and that's the big god over everything. And that's how religion came to be. So that's the argument that he made, and that's still this kind of the sociological argument. That's the basis of the sociological argument that we have today in the atheist world. Now, there's quite a few problems with these, but I'm going to lay out 2 or 3 problems, and I'm going to give some evidence for them. And the first one is this problem of the fact that it's really quite implausible. And I'm just going to read you something that we've written. It's going to hopefully be in a publication soon, inshallah, in Rational Religion. And it's this. It says, it's entirely possible that early man would seek explanations for the phenomena that affected him. What is less plausible is that he would start bowing down to the weather or to animals. What did this first look like? So, for instance, if you have, cavemen, say you have a caveman tribe, cavemen and cavewomen, Neanderthals, or whatever era you put to them, what would it first look like when you say that there are spirits and you start praying to them? Okay, so was there a caveman once who, instead of running into safety during a storm, started to praying to the storm? Okay, so you have this great force and you start praying to the storm. What would the other cavemen and women say? Would they not just see this person as basically a bit of a madman? And then, when the storm overtakes them, they'll think, well, that guy got what he deserved. And let's say we have a cave woman who, instead of hiding or hunting a lion, decides to fall down in prostration to it, right? Because you have all these natural forces and natural things. You start praying to these predators in your local world. Is that going to help? I mean, by the atheist's own logic, that is something which means you're immediately going to get naturally selected out of the population because there's no survival advantage. Unless they're saying, actually, there are spirits which you can please and which you can, pray to and which will help you. If there's no actual benefit to these things, how did they catch on? Wouldn't people, the first person who starts praying to a storm would have been thought to be someone a little bit potentially unstable. So they would have been ignored. So how did such an idea catch on? And how did it catch on, for instance, if you say, there's malaria that's ravishing you and you start praying to some kind of spirits? Does that mean that the mosquitoes aren't going to bite you anymore? So when you actually kind of think about, how did this actually happen? How did it really start off? It doesn't really make sense because you'd start engaging in an activity which would either be of, either have absolutely no effect or have a harmful effect. So there'd be no advantage for it to start socially catching on. And the idea then that you would, that all these people, based on this idea, which doesn't bring you any advantage, would then start getting together and discussing their beliefs about these spirits and then turning these spirits into idols, etc., becomes more and more implausible. There doesn't really seem to be any kind of, well, A, there's no evidence for it, but there's also no, it doesn't seem tenable. If you actually think about it, it doesn't really work. And then, of course, you have the issue that even if you say this thing did happen, we know that religion is universal. And this is coming on to the second argument. Actually, I'll get to that in a second. But we know that these phenomena are universal. Belief in the spiritual world, belief in religious beliefs. They've been found in every indigenous tribe in the world. Hume didn't know that, and he said actually that these things aren't universal. He was wrong, and later investigation found that even 100 years after him, that actually every indigenous tribe that they came across, they had beliefs and religions. So how did the same process happen everywhere in the world? That seems again implausible to say that these things happened everywhere, and you ended up with similar ideas. And this leads on to the second argument, and I've put these two together because they're quite linked. And that's monotheism is fundamental in world religions. So Hume's whole idea is that you have an evolution from polytheism to monotheism. But the actual natural history of religion, i.e. how religion generally goes, is from monotheism to polytheism. So you start with monotheism and you degenerate, you can say, into polytheism. And if that's true, if I'm right in saying that, then that is completely against what you'd expect from the secular way of looking at things. Because the secular way of looking at things is that, you add up slowly to a big God. And actually, I'll just mention lastly, even that is implausible in itself, because there is a huge divide between a big spirit, or a big a big spiritual God, like we have that ice God there, and the universal transcendent creator of the universe who existed before the universe itself and created everything. On the one hand, we have spiritual beings, by which we kind of mean invisible beings, which can influence things within the world. And on the other, you have something which is completely separate from the world and which has created everything which transcends it. You can't add up spirits so that they become universal, because that kind of thing is something very, very different. So even that idea, the idea that you can add up to a one transcendent God, doesn't make sense, because you can add up as many things which aren't transcendent. You can add up many things which are living in this world. If you took up 6 billion humans and you added them together, and you added their mass together, and you added their thoughts together, you added their power together, you'd never get to one universal God who created everything, right? You can't add up things which are worldly and get to the divine. Even that idea doesn't make sense. So there are multiple levels of why it's implausible. But we're going to focus on this second part here, which is the fact that monotheism is fundamental in world religions, and that the natural history of religion is from monotheism to polytheism. And I'm not going to go through every single religion. Revelation, Rationality, Knowledge, and Truth goes through many. I'm going to go through some of those and a few others. Actually, well, no, I'm just going to go through some of those. But whatever religious area you look at, you find the same trends. And I'll mention a few of the other ones at the end. But we're going to start with Hinduism because it's the oldest religion. Because you'd imagine that, the thing which is 3,000 years old, right? If that's got monotheism in it, if that's got clear monotheism in it, then that's compelling evidence that actually the monotheism was original. Okay, so this is what I'm gonna give you a few quotes for now, and there are many others, but these are some of the clearest ones that I could find. And this is in the Bhagavad Gita, in a book called Chapter 7, and in that the one who's revealing it says, "This is my inferior nature. But distinct from this, O valiant one, know thou that my superior nature is the very life which sustains the universe. It is the womb of all being. For I am he by whom the worlds were created and shall be dissolved. The inhabitants of the world, misled by those natures which the qualities have engendered, know not that I am higher than all of them, and that I do not change. Verily, this divine illusion of phenomenon manifesting itself in the qualities is difficult to surmount. Only they who devote themselves to me and to me alone can accomplish it." So he is saying here that this is my inferior nature, i.e. you are seeing a partial manifestation of me, but distinct from this, know that my superior nature is the life which sustains the universe, created all the world, will destroy the worlds, and that this divine illusion of phenomenon manifesting itself is difficult to surmount, difficult to really grasp and understand and to see past. Only those who devote themselves to me alone can accomplish it. Only those who devote themselves to God can actually see that this world is just an illusion, that is a manifestation of God's power, but God actually resides behind it. Here's another quote. Oh, this is from the same passage. The ignorant, or from the same chapter at least. The ignorant think of me, who am the unmanifested spirit, as if I were really in human form. They do not understand that my superior nature is changeless and most excellent. I am not visible to all, for I am enveloped by the illusion of the phenomenon. This deluded world does not know me as the unborn and the imperishable. So these are very clear monotheistic passages which are being spoken about in the Bhagavad Gita. And so we have a bit of a contradiction here, because we know that it's a, I think, 4,000+ year old religion, extremely old religion. And according to the Humean theory, what you have is religions slowly starting off very, very polytheistic, and Hinduism is very old, starting off very, very polytheistic. So that's why he thinks it's polytheistic, because it's old. Because we started off very polytheistic and we slowly got to monotheism. We slowly got to the Abrahamic faiths in Islam and Christianity. So that's how the pathway was. But in Hinduism, we have very clear monotheism. So how do you explain that? That's very, very strange. And here's another something else in the Rig Veda. They call him Indra, Mitra, Varuna, Agni, and he is heavenly, nobly winged Garutman. To what is one, sages give many a title. They call it Agni, Yama, Matarisvan. I don't know if I'm saying this right, but I hope you get the idea. To what is one, sages give many a title. So clearly this is talking about one universal God. And to be honest, even today, many Hindus will say, actually, there is one universal God, but he has, there are other gods, under him, but there's kind of one, and they, it doesn't make sense in the common conception, because they're worshipping all these different gods, and they have temples. So obviously they take them as effectively independent gods. But even now, there is still a strain of actually saying that, there is a strain of understanding that there is a universality to God. But what we would say to explain this is, well, it started off monotheistic, as you can see from many of these passages, but over the course of 4,000 years, it became polytheistic. Because what happens is that people, let me just make this full screen. What happens is that people start to, people over time, they take attributes of God and they change them. So they take attributes of God. So, we believe that God is Allah is the creator, the sustainer, and the destroyer. But what people do over time is they say, well, there's the creator, but that's one part of God, and there's the sustainer, and that's another part of God, and then there's the destroyer, which is another part of God, and we'll call these, Brahman and Vishnu, etc. And then over time, these start to be split off, and they start to be taken as completely separate gods whom they worship specifically. So the Islamic understanding is that attributes of God are taken, and over time, as a religion degenerates, they are separated off from the one God and worshipped individually. And that is able to make sense of this, because otherwise it doesn't really make sense that you have this clear monotheism in original scriptures, but you have polytheism coming out. And our theory makes the most sense of why it is that the older the religion is, in general, the more polytheistic it is. Why? Because it's had much more time to degenerate. It's had much more time to degenerate into various other forms and to have many, many more gods. So this is why, as part of the Islamic faith, we believe that all the prophets were true, and the promised Messiah clearly, very, very clearly said that we have that Krishna was a prophet of God. So this is, I think, a very good evidence in our favor, and notes that the secular and the naturalist theories can't make sense of this. They can't make sense of why there is clear monotheism in the oldest Hindu scriptures. Now, as I've said, our theory would be that the older the religion is, the more time it's had to become polytheistic. And this is borne out if you look at kind of roughly the timeline of religions. So the next religion I'm going to talk about is Zoroastrianism. And this is a fire temple. This is a Zoroastrian temple in Yazd in Iran. And Zoroastrianism is said to, they think it's about 2.5 to 3,000 years old. So in the first millennium before Hazrat Isa alayhi salam, but right towards the back of that, quite probably. And the prophet was, the foundation of the prophet in sort of English language is known as Zarathustra. And this is a picture of a priest. This is like a stone carving of a priest, in a Zoroastrian priest with the head garb, which they tend to have. And Zoroastrianism today is known as a dualistic religion. It has the idea of two gods, a good God and a bad God. But actually, this isn't really accurate. And Zoroastrians, you know, even those that still exist today, they'll often talk about how they are monotheistic. And if you look at this historically, you can see what happened. So let me just give you a few kind of a few basics of the religion. So the name for the overarching deity is Ahura Mazda. Ahura Mazda. And again, I apologize to any strange pronunciations of any of these words. Ahura Mazda. And there is a good spirit and an evil spirit in their theology. Spentu Menu is the good spirit and Angry Menu is the evil spirit. And the idea in the original Zoroastrian texts, many of which we actually still have, you know, reasonably good records of as far as I could see. And I think you'll see in a moment and probably be convinced of that. The idea is basically we are created and we have free will, and we choose between the good spirit and the evil spirit, Spentu Menu and Angry Menu. Okay, so there is an evil spirit and a good spirit. And afterlife, if we do good things, we will be admitted to this afterlife, which is called Amaritat. Again, don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, Amaritat. But what happened over time, many hundred years after Zoroastrianism was founded, is that the idea of the good spirit was incorporated into Ahura Mazda. So you have the good spirit, and that started to be incorporated into the idea of God. So these two became together, and that left just the evil spirit. And then you basically had this idea of you have this good divine spirit, and then you have the evil spirit, and they fight each other. Okay, and all of this is overseen by Zurvan, the god of time. So I think actually they became a community called the Zurvanists, I think, and they are the ones who mainly propagated this. But they weren't always accepted as being the you know, the only forebearers of Zoroastrianism. And as I say, even today, it's kind of, this isn't particularly controversial analysis. It's well known that actually it was strongly monotheistic over time. This group took it in a different direction, but you know, there's still good evidence of that in their scriptures, the monotheism. And here are a few. So as you can see, not only did I conceive of thee, O Mazda, so this is from the scriptures, not only, and this is the prophet speaking, the prophet Zarathustra, not only did I conceive of thee, O Mazda, as the very first and the last, as the father of the good mind, as the veritable creator of truth and right, as the Lord judge of our actions in life, I beheld these with my very eyes. Now remember what the Quran says, that, you know, there is not a single people to whom we did not send a messenger. And we sent the messenger saying, worship Allah and shun the evil one. So we can see this very clearly in this 3,000-year-old religion. Not only did I conceive of thee as the first and the last, he's the Lord judge of our actions in life, and I beheld these with my very own eyes. I saw the manifestations of God in this world. And then he says, he who following truth shall work for me, Zarathustra, to bring us towards the great renovation in accordance with thy purpose. For him shall be all honor and content in this world, and a fitting state in the life beyond, as verily thou hast revealed to me, O all-knowing Mazda. So again, we can very clearly see this is, you know, Islamic in the sense of Islam is submission to God, and these are, you know, quite clearly divinely revealed verses, or rather not revealed verses, but from someone who has experienced divine revelation. There's good evidence for that in this. And again, where is the faithful man who heeds me as the first to teach that? Verily, thou art the highest to invoke, in very deed, the bountiful providence, the Holy Lord. Who will hear through the good mind what truth made known to me, the truth revealed by the Creator Supreme? So again, this doesn't really fit with the Humean, with the David Hume and the secular kind of theories, because their idea is that you have very polytheistic, and it's only relatively recently that you go to monotheism. But as I'm saying, when you look at the natural history of religions themselves, like with Hinduism and now with Zoroastrianism, they start off with clear evidence of monotheism, they start off monotheistic, and then over time polytheism develops. So this starts off quite clearly monotheistic, and over time you have this dualistic conception of God coming out of it. And same with Hinduism, so old. You know, you started off with monotheism, and over time it becomes polytheistic. So let's move on to, this is the Old Testament. Let's have a brief discussion. We don't need to labor the point on this, but because we're all more familiar with it. But if we have a brief discussion about Hazrat Noah and Hazrat Ibrahim, we understand, and Khalifa Sani spoke about this in The Real Revolution, that Hazrat Nuh came with, obviously a monotheistic message, as all the prophets do. And after him, there was a period of degeneration, and after a long period, you came to the era of Hazrat Ibrahim. And Hazrat Ibrahim, we all know, fought, very greatly against the ideas of idolatry that were prevalent in his society, and have various rational and logical arguments to dispel these notions of polytheism. So you have Hazrat Nuh, who comes with monotheism, and this is recorded in the Bible, and we believe in it in the Quran as well. And everyone understands that actually there was a period of time, and then you had polytheism. So the natural history, again, is you start with something monotheistic, it goes over time towards idolatry, and then you have a prophet who comes, who brings a monotheistic religion. Okay, and then of course you have the same pattern. You have a similar pattern happening over time with the children of Abraham. For instance, if you look at the let's just jump forward a bit to the people of Hazrat Musa. Jump way forward to the people of Hazrat Musa. That they were obviously worshipping idols of various sorts. So you start off with monotheism and you go towards polytheism. And Hazrat Musa comes and he restores monotheism again. And then you have a slightly more subtle form of polytheism happening even within the Jewish faith, which is that they venerate their scholars and their scribes to be gods, and they kind of have a sense of worship. It's not a literal worship, but they have they venerate many of their religious scholars. But also you actually had a lot of idolatry creeping back into the Jewish faith anyway, and all the prophets, so many Jewish prophets came to fight that idolatry that kept coming back among the Jews. So again, you have monotheism, and then it goes into polytheism, and you have a prophet who reestablishes monotheism, and then it goes into polytheism, and you have a prophet who reestablishes monotheism. That's clearly seen in the historical record of the Bible. And we obviously don't accept everything in the Bible, but when you look at grand trends, that's when you can see there must be some kind of truth here. You don't have to agree with every single detail that certain prophets went up to heaven in a chariot of fire, etc. But if there's a general trend which is constantly being recorded, that you have idolatry coming back in, then you can see that polytheism is secondary and comes after the monotheism. And then we come to Christianity. And again, this is a very good case study, because Christianity, if we go into some of the verses, Christianity, there's a very good evidence in the Gospels themselves that Hazrat Isa was monotheistic. And I'm not going to labor this point because we, especially in the Jamaat, we have so much literature that covers this. I'm just going to mention one verse here, and that is from Mark. Then one of the scribes came, and having heard them reasoning together, perceiving that he had answered them well, asked him, "Which is the first commandment of all?" Jesus answered him, "The first of all the commandments is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." Okay, and this is throughout the Gospels. You have many, many mentions of Hazrat Isa's monotheism. And if you look at Paul Bede Johnson, so I missed out the Johnson there. He's a Christian who's a historian of Christianity, and he says that Paul's Christ had not been anchored to the historical Jesus of the Jerusalem church. The Christology of Paul, which later became the substance of the Christian universal faith, came from the diaspora and was preached by an outsider whom many in the Jerusalem church did not recognize as an apostle at all. So what he's saying is that Hazrat Isa, the idea of Christ that we're familiar with, the idea that you have a Trinity and you have the Son of God and Father and the Holy Spirit as a mediator, that idea came from someone other than Hazrat Isa, than the historical Christ. And that basically came from Paul, who, as he says, would not have been recognized as an apostle at all. So here we have, again, you have the starting off with someone who is very monotheistic, or monotheistic teachings, and over time it becomes Trinity, and over time it becomes, in the Catholic Church, you have all kinds of saints which are venerated and turned to godhood. So again, this is a demonstration of monotheism going into forms of polytheism. You can call it outright polytheism or whatever your perspective on it. It's certainly not true Unitarianism as we have in Islam. And now I'm going to just focus on a few. I'm sorry, we're coming quite, I'll wrap it up very soon. I may skip out some of the last ones, but this is I'm going to just very briefly discuss Greek history. And this is we don't know, we can't say he's a prophet because we don't know that. But there was this man called Xenophonies. This is an illustration of him. Again, I think it's quite old, I'm assuming. And he was someone who in the, I think it's around the 550s BC. So 5 to 600 years before Hazrat Isa alayhi salam. He was known as a wandering preacher who was incredibly annoyed and preached against, probably much more than annoyed. He preached against the idea of the pantheon of different Greek gods and says that these are just invented things. And he said that there is one God, greatest among gods and men, not at all like mortals in body or in thought. And he said that at certain times God shakes the world, which I think we can understand as being the idea of the hour, as-sa'a, or the idea of an apocalypse, which is that for certain peoples, God creates a punishment and creates a revolution and a spiritual revolution within them. So he's a very interesting character, Xenophonies, and he has actually, there are many more quotes of his which are monotheistic, and he even mocks the Greeks for having these what he understood as being ridiculous thoughts about the gods. And he basically just said, you guys you're just making the gods like you, whereas a true God would never be like that. And we only have his teaching in small fragments, but I think the fragments are pretty clear. So I think he's certainly worth looking into. I didn't put his name, but Xenophonies, Xenophhanes. And then not long after, but in a slightly different part of the Greek world, we have Socrates. And the Khalif Rabi said that he's prophet, and I believe previous Khalifa as well. And we have, it's amazing because he is supposed to be the founder of Western philosophy, but he very clearly claims divine revelation, and he very clearly claims that he has been commissioned by God. In fact, many of you will know he was executed. He was tried, and then they gave him a hemlock cup to drink, and the story is that he took that because he had been sentenced to death. So what was he actually sentenced? What was he on trial for? What he was on trial for, and this is clearly recorded in the Apology, is he was on trial because he was preaching against the gods of the Greeks. And he was saying that all your gods don't, they're not real. And yet he believed in one God, and he believed in revelation. And he said, but I shall be asked, why do people delight in continually conversing with you? I've already told you, Athenians, the whole truth about this. They like to hear the cross-examination of the pretenders to wisdom. There is amusement in this. So he's saying, I go and I talk to these people who think they're very wise, and I show that actually they're not that wise. And he says, this is a duty which the God, and he uses the singular for God. He says, the God has imposed upon me, as I am assured by oracles, visions, and in every sort of way in which the will or divine power was ever signified to anyone. And he spoke about a divine sign, and this is known as a problem in Western philosophy, is what was Socrates' divine sign? And he says it was a voice which, instructed him about things. And he said again, for this is the command of God, as I would have you know, and I believe that to this day, no greater good has ever happened in the state than my service to the God. So no greater good has ever happened in the state, in the Athenian state, than my service to God. For I do nothing but go about persuading you all, old and young alike, not to take thought for your persons and your properties, but first and chiefly to care about the greatest improvement of the soul. And then he says, I don't take any money for this, and I'm not having any kind of personal benefit from this. And I will just very quickly, these are just the last few slides, talk about some of the Eastern, I'll just do Buddhism as a demonstration of the Eastern religions. And I will just read out this one quote from Buddhism. Much longing after the things of this life is a disobedience, I again declare. Not less so is the laborious ambition of dominion by a prince who would be the propitiator of heaven. Confess and believe in God, Isana is the word used, who is the worthy object of obedience. For equal to this belief, I declare unto you, ye shall not find such a means of propitiating heaven. I think that means pleasing heaven. Oh, strive ye to obtain this inestimable treasure. So in Buddhism, people think, actually Buddhism is atheistic, but Khalifa Rabi very clearly, argued very successfully, and he showed that actually Buddhism has turned into its own form of polytheism because they have all these idols everywhere and of Buddha, and they go and pray to them. So it's his own form of idolatry that comes in, even from what they claim is an atheistic religion. But clearly the Buddha is talking about God and talking about one God, and what he came to rebel against, or what he came to overthrow, were the conceptions of the many hundreds of gods that were prevalent in his era and in his time. So again, we have here monotheism in the original. This isn't in a scripture. This was on a statue or in a stupa, I think they were called, which is on a a monument. And then you have form of idolatry coming after this. And this is we have more quotes from Confucius and Lao Tzu, but I just want to mention a few other cultures. This is a painting of Valhalla, which is the Norse mythology. And I'm not going to spend any time on this, but I think it's just worthy of investigation. That if you look at Norse mythology, you have the idea of, Odin, who is the All-Father. You have Thor, who is like the son of Odin, and he is the great hero. And then you have Loki. I've got a picture of Loki, but not the one you're expecting. We have this idea of Loki in, the Marvel universe and in popular culture, and he's known as the trickster. He's known as the trickster. Now, what is that very similar to? It's very similar to Satan, the deceiver, right? And then afterwards, after they fight in the way of religion, they go to this place which is the great beyond, known as Valhalla. So it's very similar to heaven. And then if actually you look further into Nordic philosophy, you find that they have this idea that at the end of time, there'll be great corruption, and then there'll be one final spiritual revolution, and you will have an era of peace after that. So again, we know that the Holy Prophet ﷺ said that every prophet warned of the Dajjal, and said to follow the message, and that there would be, and we know Islamically that there were many prophecies about the promised Messiah and this era of humanity as being the final great battle between good and evil. And we have that also in Nordic philosophy. So my point is basically, you have very similar beliefs across the world in different areas. And if you look at Native American religions, you look at African religions, you look at religions across the world, and I've already spanned most of the world in many ways, then you find the same things coming up. So how can you explain that secularly? I've already shown that the theory is implausible, to the idea that you go from mini gods up to big God, because it would never start off, it would never make sense. But then how do you also explain that across the world the same beliefs fundamentally were reached, and that those beliefs were monotheistic, and that over time, if you look at the natural history, they descend into polytheism? So let's remind ourselves of what our great philosopher here said. He said, the farther we mount up into antiquity, the more do we find mankind plunged into polytheism. No marks, no symptoms of any more perfect religion. The most ancient records of the human race still present present us with that system as the popular and established creed. The north, the south, the east, and the west give their unanimous testimony to the same fact. What can be opposed to so full an evidence? So these are very, very brave comments coming from an 18th century philosopher, which the fullness of time have indeed overthrown. And again, I direct you to read, I'm sure many of you have, but it's always worth revisiting the book Revelation, Rationality, Knowledge and Truth by Khalifa Rabi, where he goes through a lot of these, some of the religions that I've just briefly looked at in more depth, and tackles this concept in a fantastic way. So this was, completely derivative of Khalifa Rabi's analysis. So please do go have a look at that. I'm sorry I've taken so much time. I apologize, but I think we're having questions now.
Dr. Saab, for the very informative session. Yes, it did overrun a bit, but that's okay. If you guys have any questions, please just message through them to the chat, to the host, and I'll ask them through. If not, you can also raise your hands and ask the question yourself. So please, like any questions that you have, just send them through. Dr. Saab, the first question that is from Hassan Saab, and he asked that, is there any proof that Hinduism is the oldest religion?
I think it's understood to be, I think it's understood to be the oldest religion of the currently existing religions, because we have, as I understand, scriptures or evidence of that going back many thousands of years, but I can't say, I'm not a scholar in Hinduism. I'm going off the received wisdom, which is that it's thought to be 3,000 years plus, probably 4,000 years. But I'm fairly confident there's a lot of research into that, because it's very, very widely accepted, but I don't know that area specifically myself.
No problem, that's okay. It's kind of related to the next question, is related to the question that the person just asked. So basically the concept of, in Hinduism, they have, like I said as well, multiple gods. Is that in any shape or form similar to the multiple attributes of Allah that we have in Islam?
Yeah, so I think I spoke about that during the talk, which is that what explains original monotheism turning into polytheism is that when you look at these gods, they have specific attributes. They have the creator, the destroyer, the one who, the god of fertility, which really means the one who creates life. All these different specific attributes that we understand as being just attributes of God. They'll take these individual attributes and say, this is its own God, and we're going to worship this God because we want this specific thing in our lives. So I think there's good evidence, or I mean, it's not something you can actually, I think it is evidence in the sense that we see that these different gods have these different attributes, and we see in the original scripture that they belong to one God. So what must happen there is that they become split, and people choose specific ones that are more to their liking, and they worship these and they seek favor from these. And as I say, the fact that Hinduism is such an old religion and has such multiplicity is itself good evidence of that. And I would also just add, I didn't speak about Islam specifically, and Islam, alhamdulillah, in its outward form is universally monotheistic, but there are forms of idolatry, obviously, even within that. They're slightly more subtle, but in the veneration of saints and praying at saints' graves and the veneration of scholars, these are all somewhat idolatrous practices which come into Islam, but obviously they haven't spread so far, and Allah has determined that Islam will stay monotheistic, and he'll still keep irrigating the garden of Islam through the promised Messiah and now the Khulafa.
Perfect. Thank you for the explanation. That's actually very well put. And yeah, you did answer that in your presentation earlier. The next question I have is, Islam differentiates between monotheism and ideal worship. Regardless of the interpretive explanation of the concept of Trinity, can the present day Christianity be deemed to worship one God, or is it multiple gods, thus partaking in ideal worship?
Yeah, I mean, you have to be somewhat delicate while speaking to Christians. We don't want to, we don't want to say, look, you believe something different to what you say you believe. But at the end of the day, if they believe in God the Creator and God the Son, and they worship God the Son, then necessarily there is a difference between the God the Son and God the Father. Sorry, God the Father and God the Son. And if there's a difference, then you have, then obviously they're two separate entities. And then you have this Holy Spirit as well. So I think it's, fairly evident that they have a multiplicity in their idea of God and multiplicity of gods. And then when you add to that the veneration of the Catholic saints and all the various things that brings in, that's obviously mainly for Catholicism, we can see that while they may profess monotheism, their actions undermine that and their beliefs undermine that. So they have the name of polytheism because they still have an aspect of Jewish heritage. They still, they still believe in the Old Testament, which is strongly monotheistic, and they have these statements in the Gospels from Hazrat Isa, which are believing in God, who is God. But then, because like that historian Paul B. Johnson says, because Paul came and changed things and added things, they effectively have two religions. They have the religion which is their Jewish religion, and then they have this Christian religion from St. Paul. And from their Jewish religion, they're genuinely monotheistic in their outward form, and they believe in one God. But their Christian religion is that they have, Jesus is the Son. There's God the Father. There's the Holy Spirit. God effectively killed himself in the atonement, and you worship God. So they have two religions. Effectively, they have two theologies which compete with each other. And obviously, they belong to the Christian theology. but they still venerate Hazrat Isa and the gospel message. So that's why there is this contradiction, this confusion. But I think the, as I say, the evidence is fairly clear. If you believe in two separate gods with two separate wills, Jesus says, not according to my will, but your will. So they believe in two entities with two different wills. Then they believe in more than one God, and they're worshipping more than one God in that sense. But you don't want to. You have to be slightly delicate because you don't want to offend people when speaking to Christians themselves.
Jazakallah for that. Just want to remind everyone again is that if you have any questions, please either raise your hand or you can message it through and I can ask the question on your behalf. The next question I have is from Bakar Saab. And in a nutshell, basically what he's asking is that, do you have to be religious, believe in any religion of any kind in order for you to go to heaven, basically? So like be a good person.
Yeah, so it's the Islamic view is that if you want to, what one should do is one should recognize the purpose of their life. They should recognize the truth of the prophets and follow their paths. And through that, you will have salvation, which really means the love of God. And when you have the love of God in this life, that will necessarily manifest itself into the next life. And there are various hadith Qudsi that just doing actions which are deemed outwardly good, but not actually done for the sake of God, will not be treated as worthy of divine merit. So actions themselves, purely actions themselves, if they don't have a pious intention behind them and a divine intention behind them, then they are not counted towards righteous action in the religious sense. However, having said that, we also need to recognize that different people are at different levels of exposure to the true message and different levels of knowledge and understanding. So you can't be dogmatic about these things, because it could be that someone tries to do the best that they can and haven't been exposed to that message yet. And maybe they're in a place and time and when they'll never be exposed to the true message. So they may follow simply the conception of God in their hearts. And the Islamic view is, again, that the conception of God that everyone is born with is the idea of one God. So that you have a unity of God. And at that point, in a sense, if you loosely belong to another religion by name, it may be that for any given individual who still follows an internal conception of one God and tries to do good in the world, that God will be pleased with them and admit them to paradise in the next life. And Khalifa Sani even said that he said that you can have, it's plausible that there would be someone who doesn't believe in God at all, and he said he's maybe not very smart and he lives in the mountains and he's completely away from all kinds of messages, but he tries to do something good in the world. Allah may also look favorably upon such a person. So what we can't say is really rule things out which God himself has not ruled out. God says that his mercy encompasses all things. He says that he'll punish idolatry. Okay. But if someone, tries to be a good person, they don't have a formalized religious belief, God may very well have mercy upon that person in the next life. And in fact, the last thing I'll say in response to this is there's that famous story from one of the saints, I'm afraid I can't remember who, where they, actually no, there's a hadith on this as well, which is that someone came to the Holy Prophet ﷺ and said, will I be rewarded for the pious action which I did before accepting Islam? And the Holy Prophet ﷺ said that you coming into Islam is your reward for that. So God knows the intentions of people, and he knows the actions of people. And even if someone doesn't have a formalized religious belief, he may guide them towards the true religious belief on the basis of their actions. And as for those who don't formally accept, we don't know what's in their hearts. Even if they profess something outwardly, they profess, I belong to this religion. We don't really know who they're praying to, what's in their heart. Only Allah Ta'ala knows this. Only God himself can judge these things. So we need to be careful not to be sort of dogmatic and exclude things. We can only say what the Quran itself says about those issues, and the rest, the Khulafa have shed light on in the way I've just said, to my understanding.
That's actually very informative. I think you kind of take the first step by becoming a good person, isn't it? Like just doing the right things. And then you kind of like all these prayers and religion is designed for yourself to then go to the next stage.
Yeah.
It's like your career or like school and everything. The next thing is it's more of like a statement from Masusa. It's basically saying as we uncover more truth behind the lies or irregularities within the Christianity religion and other religion, I suppose. For example, they say that Jesus Christ was born on the 25th of December, and that's what we celebrate Christmas. But we know that it was same day, but on a different in late summer. Yet, majority of Christians choose to ignore this fact. So, what sort of hope do we have that we uncover all these, not truthful statements, and what difference will that make to their followers?
There's always a place for academic research into these things. Cumulatively, when you put them all together, they can help to show that there may be, and we believe obviously there are, serious intellectual problems with the faith and with the claims of the faith, and show that actually a lot of rituals, a lot of festivals, and then you can say their theology was human invention. And so, that's a small aspect of a larger worthy field of study, which is, the research into the beliefs of Hazrat Isa. What did Hazrat Isa really believe, and then what did later Christians say, and what do they attribute to him? So that's not in itself going to be particularly useful, but there is still a place for that wider field of actually looking into things, and that can be certainly very, very important for people to show that there is not sound intellectual basis for this religion. And we would obviously say that there is for Islam, and we can present our case, and individuals will have to go away and look at that. But that's only one half of things. There's obviously the other aspect of it is your spirituality and also your morals. So if you're doing tabligh to an individual, if you can show that you have moral, if they see that you're morally good, then that often is very impressive. And if they meet lots of Ahmadis and impress them morally, then that's something which is important. Not in itself necessarily sufficient, but it's important. And then spirituality itself, if they see that you have a spiritual aspect to you and there's evidence of that. But also fundamentally, it's, is God still speaking? And that's what the Prophet Messiah came to show. He obviously showed the other aspects to the extreme as well, but he showed very clearly that Allah Ta'ala is revealed many, many things to him through all of his true revelations. The revelation about the World War I prophecy, the death of Lechem, the plague, so many different things which he said, which came true. And then you'd ask, well, where is that amongst the followers of Christianity? Why can't you do that now? Which is what the Prophet Messiah himself put forward, and it's a very decisive verdict against Christianity. So for any individual, it's very different what will guide them away or towards a particular faith. But everything has its place. The moral and spiritual things have their place on a more personal level. The intellectual academic rigor has its place. But the best things I think that we can do is, direct them towards the Prophet Messiah and show the signs of Islam. But I mean, it'll depend on the individual, kind of if you're doing individual tabligh, and all these things add up towards the towards conversions. But the Prophet Messiah himself said that Allah himself and the angels will fight Christianity, and we've seen just basically disappeared over the last century. So we do what we can and we play our part, but ultimately it's God himself who takes care of these things and establishes the true religion.
Exactly for that. I think even it's a fairly simple thing, isn't it? Like our job is to just pass the message on. The rest we leave up to Allah. And ask anyone that does tabligh is literally your job is just to pass the message on. Everybody has their own journey. I think we only got a few minutes to answer one last question, and we'll wrap up then. So, Dr. Seth, if I can just briefly.
Can I quickly ask? Are there any more from the chat or not?
This is the last one from the chat.
These are from the chat. Okay, cool. Yeah.
Yeah. So this last one, and it's basically in today's day and age in society, we have parents that have, one is a faithful parent that practices religion, whereas the other one not. And unfortunately, it's unfortunate that they might have split up, or if they are together, they're still together. they're not meeting eye to eye on the religious beliefs. So how can they combat this issue to ensure that their children are brought up in a God-loving, beliefs?
I mean, this is probably more of a Tarbiyat issue in some respects, and it's very difficult to answer without the specifics. If the specifics are to do with Ahmadis and Ahmadi parents, then there's one answer. If they're non-Ahmadis, then it's difficult to say. In general, I mean, it will be the responsibility of the person who is, in this example, more religious, to try and ensure that they still have a good religious upbringing. The primary way that you're going to do that is through prayer and through praying for your child that their hearts incline towards Allah Almighty, and you try and keep alive their connection to Khilafat. That will be very, very important. And you let them, you help them to create that relationship with Khilafat through mulaqats, when they're possible in person again, but also through MTA and through letter writing, and keep alive their connection to Khilafat. And then it's also to, in your own example, that they see the value of Islam. Because if in this hypothetical example you have one parent who is not particularly close, to faith, and one who is, then the child should be able to see the difference in the quality of how you act, and also the answers to your prayers as well. So you have to be a good example as much as possible. But as with all of these things, ultimately, there's only so much that you can do, and the best thing you can do is pray for them very, very sincerely. And as I said, attach them to the Jamaat, but it's going to be the prayer that's key, as well as attaching them to the Jamaat through Khilafat and showing a good example. Those are some answers. I'm sure there's better forms of that answer and other things that one can do.
Jazakallah. I mean, you're 100% right. It's not one very easily answered. I think, I'm not sure, but there's a saying, like, I don't know if it's a Prophet Messiah saying, but do not worry about your children on the fear of hunger, I will feed them. So it kind of like just goes to show that basically, in essence, they're not your property. So, you just have to do the best you can to do right by them, and hopefully, and your prayers and everything, Allah will take care of that. That's all we have time for today. Dr. Saab, I want to thank you for a wonderful presentation that you gave, and for answering all the questions that we had coming in. And I just want to thank everyone that joined in today. I know it kind of got a bit of a slightly longer session than normal. Next week is going to be Urdu session, so if you can, please join, and invite everyone else to join as well. And yeah, if you have any questions or whatever it is, please do not hesitate to send them across. So have a lovely week, and inshallah we will see you next week. Sorry.